So in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about how Dan Pena created $820 into $450 million in equity value. And there's a lot of information through his podcasts. He has talked about it in his interviews, but there are details that he has not talked about that he shares in the seminar. And there are other details that are shared in his books. And there are many videos that I've watched, many hundreds of videos that I have watched where the whole story comes together. So I've picked up data from all over the place, and I'm going to be going through it in a chronological order so that you have a perspective of how this model of buying profitable companies started off. And if you have been watching my channel, if you enjoy the video, hit that subscribe button so that you can keep getting a notification every time a video launches. And I make sure that every single video is valuable to you from a business standpoint, and that I can give you a very high rate of return on your time in terms of acquiring knowledge and key information. So I'm very thoughtful with the videos I make. I think a lot before I speak. So you're going to benefit if you subscribe. So let's get into the topic. Now, it'll be important the reason I'm sharing this information is because it'll be important to understand and look into and analyze where this model emerged. What is the basis of the model? Because a lot of the people, they read books and then they try to share with it, but he has really developed this based on his experience and based on real life experience. And it would be helpful to look into his career and find out how did he discover this himself? Who was the person that taught him? Was it one person or was it several people? And where does the mindset and psychology comes from? So let's get started. So he started off as a real estate agent, in his 20s. And he was selling real estate and making some money. He was an employee. And I think simultaneously he was doing his graduation. When he got graduated, I think he did corporate finance. He studied corporate finance, and then after being a real estate agent, he went to work for Bear Stearns. It's an investment banking firm at the time where even the KKR guys had just left the Bear Stearns when he entered, or they were there at the same time. And KKR is one of the largest private equity firms that have billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. And these people discovered the world of mergers and acquisitions and the world of private equity. I'm talking about KKR now. And these people worked at Bear Stearns and they were orchestrating acquisitions. That's where for their clients. So that's where they started to see, how the legal agreements are structured, how the financing is structured. And these guys were just brokers. And then they took that knowledge, they went out and then they started buying companies. They did some of the largest acquisitions in the world, in excess of $15-20 billion at the time, including the famous acquisition of RJR Nabisco. I think it was more than $10 billion. And at that time, this is pre-internet era, so these are big numbers. And even if you consider inflation, it's a very big number because it was a long time ago in the 80s. So Dan Pena went to work at the same firm that the KKR worked. And probably some of his intellectual capabilities of how acquisitions are structured came from Bear Stearns. Okay. And then he started to work for Onassis Group. Aristotle Onassis was a multi-billionaire, very powerful guy. And he had this company and he had a division within his company which was to do with shipping. And the head of that shipping was Aristotle Onassis. He was the CEO of the Onassis shipping line. And when you have a very big conglomerate and you have various divisions, each division may have a CEO. So Aristotle, Konstantin Gratsos was the guy who was the CEO of the Onassis shipping line. So he started to work for Konstantin Gratsos, and that's where he developed a lot of his deal-making abilities because he saw Konstantin Gratsos do a whole bunch of stuff. And this is where the seller's finance came about. So he saw, when he was working for the Onassis Group, he saw that Onassis Group would buy ships as sellers finance. What does that mean? Meaning the shipping company would give them ships without charging them, and then they had to use these ships for business purposes, and from that cash flow they would pay for the ship. And that was the deal, and that's where the origins of sellers finance came in, and it's a big part of the QLA model that he teaches in his seminar, which is around buying profitable companies and creating wealth. So after he started to work for the Onassis Group, he went and he tried his first roll-up. He tried his first business acquisitions venture, and he totally bombed it. It did not work out. I think he was in his 30s by this time, and he owed the law firms and accounting firms a lot of money, and it took him 3 years to pay off the fees. And by the end of that, he was sitting in his studio apartment at the age of 35 or 36, crying, and it's a famous scene that he narrates, and he was drinking Jack Daniel and he was crying, and his dogs were licking his tears because he was nowhere near his goals, and he had failed at this venture, and he was completely heartbroken and devastated, and he was living in a studio, and his first child was born. And I asked him during the seminar, how did you do this with no money? How did you do this with just $820? So this point where he had the $820 was during this time where he had the failed venture, and this was a starting point when he was crying. And he told me, I did it with great difficulty. And then he explains this, then he shares this story. So he's at the studio in New York, and he's crying, and this is where he comes up with an idea to do a government contract bidding, a government contract deal. And that government contract was worth $50 million, and he raised, I think he raised $50 million or something, or he orchestrated a deal that was valued at $50 million. And there was a much bigger company that he collaborated with and financiers, and he connected the two. So he was just a connector. He was a broker at the deal, on the deal, and he did it with just a leased fax machine and a telephone, and that's it. And he made, I think, about $36,000 or $50,000. So that money, that initial capital, helped him sustain, and that's when he started his acquisitions venture in oil and gas, which is through Great Western Resources. So initially the name was a little bit different. He formed the company, and then he changed the name, and then he started to acquire oil and gas companies. And you might be, he's very larger than life, and you might think that he would have done bigger acquisitions at the beginning, but his acquisitions were small sized, couple of $1 million each, and he acquired several companies, couple of $1 million. I think then he did a $10 million deal, and finally one of his CFOs was in a first class flight where he met an executive of another oil and gas company who was looking to sell, and this company was Bow Valley USA, which the value of this company was at the time more than $100 million. So this was a very big acquisition, and the idea was to acquire these companies, to acquire this big Bow Valley company, and then take these assets public on the stock exchange market. And a lot of the things went wrong during that acquisition, but somehow they ended up acquiring this company. They raised funds from banks, investors, they came up with the financing, and they acquired this company. And I think before the age of 40 or at the age of 40, he took the company public. And it was the same day that Jaguar was going public. And his stock performed better than Jaguar because they were paying dividends. So that goes back to the sales pitch, is that was one of the stocks that were paying dividends. And that was the basis, and then the stock soared. He was doing really well, and I think at the peak the valuation was about 420 million or 450 million. And this is where he went and he bought himself a castle. So he bought himself a castle before his 40th birthday, and there is actually a video of that, and I'm going to leave the link below for you to see it. that this man, who's now 78 years old, has been living in a castle since the age of 40. So he wasn't always in the seminar business, and he hasn't gotten rich just because of teaching programs. He got rich by doing deals. So and that's a lesson, that in a few years you can just turn your life around. And he started off at $820, and now he was living in a castle. And he said that he visualized it, he dreamt about it. And it's very difficult to visualize a castle when all you have is $820 and you're living in a studio. But that's the power of dreams. So anyway, so he bought the castle, and then he continued to be the CEO. And then I think Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq or Kuwait. I don't know. I'm not a big history guy or war guy, actually. But Saddam Hussein invaded a country, and I think Kuwait and Iraq went on war. But for whatever reason, the oil price went down, and his entire portfolio was dependent on one commodity, which is oil. And oil, oil price is very volatile. Oil price is the first thing that changes when there is an economic crash. Oil price would suddenly go up or down, and the entire business gets affected. And because of that, his stock price went down, and most of his net worth evaporated when that happened. And he somehow saved the company and somehow saved his stock. And then after that, he ended up selling that stock. And then he went on to the seminar business and the coaching business. And as he was doing the coaching business, he was also involved in deals. He continued to do M&A, and he did joint ventures with the people who attended his seminars. And that's where a lot of his other kinds of wealth was developed after that. And then, so now he does that. He's into advising and coaching. He wasn't that famous at the time. He collaborated with Jay Abraham. He even narrated a story with him and Tony trying to get into a joint venture, Tony Robbins, where he had an opportunity to buy his franchise, and the deal did not work out. So he shared some of those stories as well. And then he went into this business of teaching. He even taught at a university for some time, and then he got out and went into this coaching business. And then he started to meet more and more entrepreneurs who wanted to do it. He shared his intellectual knowledge, and then they went and started to create a lot of wealth. One of the guys he trained was Klaus Kleinfield. Another one was Bruce Whipple. You might have seen his videos. He's from the old days. But Klaus Kleinfield was the general manager of Siemens, the German company. And after attending the seminar, he became the CEO. And recently, he did one of the largest deals in recorded history by connecting 2 or 3 governments together to create the city of Neom. I think Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and one more country, I think Qatar, they came together and they invested about $1 trillion. And now that deal is worth, I think, about $2 trillion, where they're creating the city of the future, Neom. And this project has been going on for a long time, and it was orchestrated and initiated by one of his mentees, Klaus Kleinfield, Dr. Klaus Kleinfield. So that's just the size and scope of his influence. And also, I think he had suggested to one of his lawyers, Rick Scott. This is based on what Dan has said. And Rick Scott was a lawyer. He's now, I think, the governor or senator in Florida. And he used to represent Dan in deals as a lawyer. And he asked Dan Pena, how do you do these, how can I do what you're doing? And he said, go into healthcare, go into acquisitions. And Rick Scott ended up creating one of the largest healthcare companies in the world at the time, Colombian Healthcare. Again, all of this is based on what Dan has said. Another thing that I want to point out is that when I went to the Castle seminar, a lot of these achievements are on his walls. As you enter the seminar room, there are so many newspaper cuttings from the 80s, 90s that you can see. You can see his photographs, you can see his former board members, you can see him holding checks when he's very, very young. So you get to see a lot of that on his walls. And not to mention that there are many interviews that he has done when he's in his 50s, in his 40s. You can see the Guthrie Castle at his 40th birthday. So I went into this rabbit hole of tracking his history, and kind of mapping out where this model got developed. And maybe that's why he likes healthcare so much, is because it's stable. It's not like oil and gas where the fluctuation is really high, and probably that's why he recommends all of his students and people who listen to him to go into healthcare and go into stable sectors, because he doesn't want you to go through the pain that he went through, right? And the basis of sellers finance. I think at one point when he was doing acquisitions, he discovered the delayed fees of law firms, because law firms can sometimes, for some specific clients, work on delayed fees, but they're not going to disclose that to every client that comes along. And he was involved with somebody at in a meeting with a law firm, and this guy, the other guy, not Dan Pena, the other guy referred that, can you delay the fees? And the law firm said yes. And then Dan said, how did you do that? And then he explained it to him, and that's how it got added in the seminar, the delayed fee section, the famous delayed fee section. So sellers finance, delayed fee section, and another thing which is leveraged buyouts, which is buying a company by keeping the company as a collateral. So just like you buy a real estate, you put the real estate as a collateral, you raise money on that basis, and you pay off the seller using that money. So basically you leverage the asset that you're buying to borrow money and to secure ownership in the asset that you're buying. It could be a company, it could be a real estate. So it's very similar to a real estate loan. When you buy real estate, what you're buying itself is the collateral. You don't have to put your own collateral. You can just put you're buying as the collateral. So when you do that for companies, it's known as leveraged buyout. And the whole KKR, the famous private equity firm that grew to over several hundred billion, was formed based on this principle of leveraged buyouts. These guys didn't have any money. These guys were brokers. These guys were just deal orchestrators. And the firm started with, I think, $100,000 or $200,000, and now it's worth hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Look up KKR. Maybe I'll leave a link of that too, so that you understand the origins of this business model of creating wealth through buying companies, buying profitable companies, using the companies itself as collateral, and raising capital from the banks, and using the cash flows of the company to pay off the loans and securing ownership. Not just in one company, but in several companies, you secure ownership and you consolidate all of that into one holding company. Then you can take it public, or you could sell it as a private sale. Now, KKR has been acquiring assets for a long time. And probably they acquired some assets, they would sell some assets, collect the cash, acquire more assets, consolidate ownership, sell it, and then they keep doing this and keep collecting cash. And now eventually at some point, when they had enough assets and enough cash, they went public. And these guys were, everything that they were doing were totally private. Very few people knew about it. And there is no way for people to know about what these guys are doing other than lawyers and accountants who were part of the deal, and investment bankers. Those people knew what KKR was doing. Probably guys like Trump who, knew about it, but the general public didn't know about KKR. It was a very close-knit circle in New York City. But once they went public, so did their strategy. So thankfully, you can actually go and verify, and you can look into the story of KKR. It's pretty inspiring how it started with no money. So this is for the skeptics who think, oh, this can't be built with no money. It has been built with no money. Okay, it's not just Dan Pena, it's also KKR, it's also BlackRock, it's also Blackstone. This is the whole ecosystem of private equity firms that have come about not too long ago. So this is not very old. This has come recently. And KKR, BlackRock, Blackstone, these are the companies that were emerging in the 70s and 80s. So look up these companies. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and I'll talk to you soon.